All right, what's going on, everybody? I thought we would jump right into the Torah this week. And obviously, we want to begin with the book of Genesis. Now, remember, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes called the books of Moses, sometimes called the Law, sometimes called the Pentateuch. But it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, as we begin with Genesis, the book of Genesis records the beginning. That's the name of the book. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Sometimes that word can be translated origin. And not only does it record the beginning of creation or the beginning of history, according to the Israelites, but it records the beginning of sin, or what some call the fall. But ultimately, and while the book is kind of fast-paced up until a man called Abram, ultimately this is where the book slows down and kind of the lens is focused in on this man, Abram, or who we know as Abraham. He is essentially the first Jew. He is a man who is called by God to leave his home, and move to a land that God would show him. As he does this, we see God work in and through his life, and God makes a covenant with him. He promises to make his name great. He promises to give him descendants as numerous as the sands on the shore and the stars in the sky. He promises that he and his family would be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And it's a huge problem for Abram because at that point he is childless, and he's thinking, how in the world is that going to happen? Ultimately, he does have a child, and God does fulfill his promise, giving him a child by the name of Isaac. Isaac would then have 2 other sons by the name of Esau and Jacob. Jacob would be the son that is kind of chosen to carry on the family legacy, so to speak. He is the one, again, and you kind of see this focusing in on particular people from God's perspective. Jacob is definitely not a good man. His name means heel snatcher or trickster, and we see that characteristic throughout his life. However, he will have an encounter with God, and his name would ultimately be changed to Israel. He will have 12 sons. Those 12 sons will become what we call the 12 tribes of Israel. And by the end of the book of Genesis, one of those sons, Joseph, is sold into slavery in Egypt. He ultimately rises in the ranks, becomes a very high official in Egypt, and saves his family from famine. And then there is about a 400-year period that takes place between essentially the end of Genesis up until the book of Exodus. And during that period, at some point, the Israelites became slaves in Egypt. And that's where the Exodus starts. And of course, the Exodus records this dramatic event, which has been memorialized in different kinds of movies, whether you're talking about the 10 Commandments or you're talking about Prince of Egypt or Exodus, Gods and Kings that came out some time ago. And this is the record of how Moses brought the people of Israel out of Egypt. And in doing so, he helps to create a distinct people by giving them God's law. Moses, according to many scholars, is credited with actually putting together the first 5 books of the Bible. And Exodus gives that record, the exiting or the exodus of the people of Israel out of Egypt, the giving of the law from Mount Sinai, and of course the subsequent wanderings of the people of Israel in Egypt, or not in Egypt, but in the wilderness. That being said, you go to the book of Numbers, and that kind of records that there's a lot of different things in the book of Numbers, and some interesting things there. There's a lot of names. You'll go through some records of names and different things like that, which is an exhilarating read. Or you can just kind of skip all that and get to the narrative parts, which is generally what I do. And as you begin to read those narrative parts, this is the part where Israel's kind of wandering around in the wilderness. They had failed to go into the promised land, the land that had been promised to Abraham years prior. And they had failed to go in there. They were afraid. And so they wandered in the wilderness for about 40 years. And Numbers is kind of a record of that. There's some interesting things in the book of Numbers. There's this guy named Balaam who has his donkey talk to him and when he's trying to curse Israel. And there's a couple of other things. There's this whole issue where the people of Israel kind of bit by snakes. And the only way they can save themselves is to look at a bronze snake that Moses has made. And so there's some quirky little things in there. Interesting reads there, to say the least. Then you go to the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus is a book that basically gives you the rituals and the regulations involved in the worship of God in the tabernacle. It is a sacrificial system where animals and sometimes grain is offered to God in repentance and appreciation, different things like that. Different sacrifices mean different things. And this is a book basically regulating how all that is to transpire. And then you go to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is essentially called second law. It doesn't mean there's another law besides what was given on Sinai. This is kind of a recapitulation of that law, maybe in a little more detailed form. And it's kind of Moses' last hurrah, the last thing he says to the people before he dies and before they go into the promised land. And it's kind of like Moses saying, okay, here is your covenant with God. Here is what is expected of you, and here is what God will do in return. You do all these things, and it's an expansion. In addition to that, it's an expansion of the Ten Commandments and how that plays out in everyday life to the Israelites. So that's kind of an overview of the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. I hope that helps, and if you have any questions, let me know.